Hi, my name is Lisa, and I'm doing my research proposal on the effects of incentives on employee motivation and productivity for the millennial generation. After researching the incentives in the workplace and how they affect employee performance to see what, if any, relationship exists between those two variables, I realized that some of the more current articles I was reading was focusing on the shift in the population of the current working generation. So the millennial generation makes up about 50% of the working population today. That is what the shift is from previous generations. But this generation is known for a lot of different characteristics that didn't really apply to previous generations. So they're known especially for job hopping and not staying with companies for long periods of time. So this is causing companies to have to rethink their current efforts to recruit and retain these employees. Most people would assume that everybody is motivated by money, but current research has shown that this may not be the case for many of the individuals within the millennial generation due to the fact that the things that satisfy them in their workplace are much different from previous generations. So this got me thinking about whether millennial workers would be more motivated by other incentives that appealed more to their core values instead of just money. So this really research proposal explores the relationship between workplace incentives and employee motivation, performance, retention, and recruitment in the millennial generation. And I'm going to be using quantitative research methods to show that. According to my research, the cost of employees leaving a company can cost up to as much as 250% of an employee's annual salary. And this typically results in an overall loss of productivity for the company until a replacement can get up and running. So, to put that into perspective, if a millennial employee is hired for $40,000 a year and then they quit within their first or second year, the cost of that employee leaving could be up to $100,000 just to replace them. So that's a significant cost for businesses. So since the millennial generation is known for job hopping, my problem statement for this paper focuses on the fact that if HR departments and upper level management don't start examining proper recruitment and retention methods for millennial employees, then productivity and monetary costs associated with replacing them could potentially cost businesses their entire company, especially if they are smaller businesses. The purpose of this study is going to be to examine the relationship between workplace incentives and employee motivation and performance, retention, and recruitment in the millennial generation. So the idea behind this is that if incentives that more closely align with millennial values and workplace satisfiers, so the things that um, millennials like in their workplace, that they value in their workplace, then they will increase their productivity in the workplace due to their increase in motivation. As a byproduct of the use of these incentives to increase employee productivity, the idea is that the use of these incentives to recruit and retain employees or to recruit employees will also cause them to be retained with the company. So millennial employees will want to stick around and continue working for the same company because they're being offered incentives that align more with their values and goals and make them feel like they're valued and part of the company, which is something that millennials really value overall is the culture of the business and feeling like they're important. So my literature review begins by discussing the definition of a generation and how generational values can affect motivation. After that little introduction, I'm going to talk more about positive and negative effects of using financial incentives in the workplace, since that's what previous research kind of focused on. There wasn't a ton of research on the use of other types of incentives in the workplace. And I'm also going to talk more about some current research that shows the shift in factors that motivate the newer working generation. So these job satisfiers that seem to be more closely aligned with the millennial generation. And then I'm going to explore the possibility of the connection between the use of job satisfiers as incentives to increase workplace productivity. So my theoretical framework was based on one of about 5 theories that I found that previous studies have kind of utilized to guide their their research on the use of incentives in the workplace. So I chose to use the expectancy theory because this theory provides an explanation of why people might choose one behavior over another. So in this case, the theory works under the belief that a person is motivated to do something because they think their actions are going to lead to their desired outcome. So in other words, people modify their behavior based on their calculation of anticipated outcomes, and then the higher the reward, the greater the performance. So since the expectancy theory can be tied to the use of money as a reward in the workplace based on previous research, that's really the only incentive that I found it tied with in previous research. It should also be able to be applied to the use of other incentives in the workplace, as long as these incentives are ones that actually motivate the employees. So in my conceptual framework, I added an additional box here in terms of figuring out what actually satisfies these workers. So trying to figure out what satisfies the workers first will then lead to increased effort in order to obtain an incentive. And then when they receive their reward, the incentive that was promised to them, then the idea is that it's going to continue motivating them to increase their productivity to get these incentives and continue getting them. So you'll see that I had an extra arrow added here, just kind of showing that the cycle doesn't just end with the employee getting the incentive. The idea is that it's going to continue to motivate them if it's an incentive that the employee truly values. So I had 3 different research questions for this project. So the first research question is, how does the use of job satisfiers as incentives by upper level management and recruiters impact motivation for these employees? Second question is, how does the use of job satisfiers as incentives impact productivity levels for millennial employees? And then the third research question is, how does the use of these incentives impact job satisfaction levels for millennial sales-based employees? So really I'm looking at how does the use of these incentives impact motivation, productivity levels, and job satisfaction levels for millennial sales-based employees. So my hypothesis for this study is going to be that if companies utilize incentives that are based on millennial job satisfiers, they'll be more likely to see an increased workplace productivity due to increased motivation and job satisfaction with the millennial workforce. For my research design, I'm going to be doing a quantitative study, and I will be using a survey method to obtain my research rather than using a traditional experimental design method. I'm actually just more interested in seeing a relationship between the variables being tested via a description of trends and attitudes and opinions of the sample population, rather than focusing on so much on numerical data and making sure that I'm keeping other variables constant and that I have a control group to compare the results with, because it's not really easy to do in a population like this where you're trying to study them in their workplace. It's difficult to keep other things constant. So data is going to be collected longitudinally, so that means over time, through survey results and individual monthly sales quotas. So I'm going to be doing this longitudinal data collection because I want to see how long, if at all, the incentive actually improves employee performance, and if the allure of a particular incentive might die off over time. So if you think back to my conceptual framework that I was talking about, where the use of the incentive will then continue motivating employee productivity, and that cycle continues, I want to see how long that will continue. So data is going to be in the form of monthly sales quotas, because this data is going to be unique to every person, and it's pretty easy to gather and is a direct representation of employee motivation to do their job. So my population is going to be millennial employees in a large sales-based company. So these would be companies that maybe do medical sales, real estate, loans, something where it's easy to track sales data. So these employees are going to be identified through HR data that's provided by the company, specifically just looking for millennial individuals. So I'm going to need to get their birth date and that sort of thing to figure out who this population is, to figure out how many people are available to participate. And the participants are not going to be aware of what I'm studying specifically to help avoid swaying the results in one direction or another. They're just going to know that they're going to be participating in a study on millennial workers should they choose to participate. My sampling method is going to be a non-probability sampling method, and I'm going to be using judgment sampling. So non-probability means that it's non-random. The reason that it's not going to be random is because I have to choose participants that are from the millennial generation. So that's going to narrow down the population that I can choose from. And judgment sampling is basically what it sounds like. I'm picking employees or participants based on their age. So I'm judging what's best to be used for this study. And then my estimated sample size, I actually used a chi-square power analysis calculator to determine what the best sample size would be to help make sure that my results are accurate and valid. So since I have one independent variable, the ideal sample size would be 39 participants. And I plan to put them into 3 different groups, which I'll talk about here in a minute, based on 3 different incentives. So 13 participants per group. For data collection, I plan to gather data on millennial job satisfiers from previous research just to get an idea of what these satisfiers would be. Then I'm going to survey the millennial employees within the company that I am performing the study on their current job satisfaction using like a Likert scale rating, where basically like 1 to 5 rate your current satisfaction with each of these different job satisfiers. And this survey will essentially serve as their informed consent on participating in the study. So if they do the survey, then that means that they're agreeing to participate. And it lets them know more about what the study is going to be. Then I'm going to gather baseline data on current sales volume for all of the employee participants as an indicator for their workplace performance. And then I'm going to implement 3 of the job satisfiers as incentives in the workplace. So these 3 job satisfiers I'm implementing would be the 3 most commonly listed job satisfiers that I determined from my research. So in step 1 of the data collection. So each participant would not be offered all 3 incentives. Instead, they would be offered 1. And then they're going to be studied in groups to compare those 3 groups, those 3 categories, to see if one of the 3 incentives is more appealing or motivating than another. And then I'm going to monitor workplace performance through sales made for the millennial participants over the course of 6 months. I chose 6 months to allow the excitability or newness of an incentive to wear off to see if that would affect workplace productivity. And this will kind of help show whether the incentive is really useful to improve job performance long term or not. And then at the end, I'm going to survey millennial employees on their job satisfaction just to see if their satisfaction has changed and they're more satisfied and more likely to stay at their current job based on the incentives that they're offered. For data analysis, I'm going to start by discussing the number of participants that didn't complete the survey on job satisfaction and explain how that might have created bias in the job satisfiers shown or in the participants that are shown or participating in the study. And then I'm going to do a descriptive analysis on the variables of the study, so average, standard deviation, range of scores for the variables, just to kind of help wrap our heads around the data that was collected. And then I will perform a statistical analysis of the data collected to determine whether the results were significant or not, meaning was my hypothesis supported or not supported by the research. So I'm going to actually be doing this through chi-square tests, since this compares 2 variables to see if they're related. And it also helps to, it's the best choice for comparing categories. So since I've got 3 different incentives, 3 different categories, that's why I chose this test. As far as implications for research go, the goal of this study is going to be to help HR professionals determine best practices for recruiting employees of the millennial generation. And then also this should help management, upper level management, determine the best methods to retain younger employees. Not necessarily just through the use of incentives, but it might shed some light on how improved communication and management styles could affect their retention, especially if those management and communication styles are more geared towards millennial values and what they're looking for in a job. As far as recommendations for future research goes, this study could be expanded outside of the sales realm to determine if the data collected holds true for other working environments as well. So I'm focusing on kind of a small sector of businesses in this study just because it makes it a little bit easier to collect data. But I would be interested to see if it would hold true in other situations where employees maybe don't have to sell things, but to see how it affects their motivation in those types of environments. And then these are my references. Thanks.